here and introduce to you my dear colleague from Marine Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, Professor Sandra Yuter, and she is fellow of American Meteorological Society.
Yes.
And editor of the American Meteorological Society Journal of Applied Meteorology and Climatology. She has her PhD in atmospheric sciences from University of Washington, and she has joined North Carolina State University in 2005, and since she has built really an amazing program here, working with multispectral satellite data, radar, LiDAR, and some pretty amazing in situ meteorological measurements. So I will let her to show some of the exciting work that she has been doing over the past couple of years, and we will learn a little bit more about how all the geospatial work that's going on in the area that is a little bit different than what we are usually used to see and in atmospheric science and meteorology.
Okay, great. Thank you, Helena, for that introduction. I really appreciate the invitation to talk to you all today in the Geospatial Forum. And this talk is drawn from work that my research group has done over the years with significant contributions from Matt Miller, sitting in the back. He's a senior research scholar, and from a number of students, including Nicole Hoban, Levi Lovell, Laura Tompkins, and Matt Wilbanks. And this work was funded by a variety of agencies. So my goals for this talk are to introduce my research group's work to you all in the center, to discuss some commonalities in practice, and to also seek some potential collaborations as we get to know each other a little better. So it's actually quite unusual for me to be giving a talk to an audience that is primarily not meteorologists, and to kind of just warm everybody up, I'd like to just ask a question as a think, pair, share about how do you use weather data? So if you could just think about it for a moment and then discuss at your table, and then I'll kind of go around a room and just kind of find out how people use weather data themselves. So please proceed. Either one. However, whatever you. Well, go talk to Helene. I'll give you about another 20 seconds or so. Now I'm probably going to go break the camera. All right, so let's start over here. What are some of the ways that you use weather data?
We were talking about we use it to figure out what clothes we should wear tomorrow.
Okay, what clothes?
Whether we should bring our umbrella to work or not.
All right, how about back in the corner there?
We're the same.
The same. All right. Yes.
Outdoor activities.
Outdoor activities. All right. All right. What else?
When we fly with UAVs, we need to check if the wind is not strong.
Okay. UAV operations. Okay. What else?
Plants and gardening.
Okay. Plants and gardening. Okay. What else?
Yeah, we use weather data to forecast the spread of emerging infectious diseases.
Okay, infectious diseases. Yeah. What else?
We unsuccessfully used weather data this morning to collect observations of storms. Collect more data.
Collect more data. All right, so now the next question is, where do you get your weather data? So, discuss. Where do you get your weather data?
Maybe it's like WR.
No, maybe no. It's not really.
All right, so let's see what we got. How about over here? Where do you get your weather data? Weather.com. All right. All right, where else?
IPCC
The IPCC?
for summarized weather data. International Panel on Climate.
That's actually climate data.
Yeah, it's got
All right, it's got some weather. All right, we'll put it there.
temperature.
Okay, what else? Where else?
Phone app.
The iPhone, you have a weather app on your phone?
No.
Where else?
Weather Underground.
Weather Underground, okay.
National Weather Service.
Okay.
NOAA.
Let's say National Weather Service, NOAA is kind of the same thing.
And when we are in the field, we actually measure the wind.
Okay, so you get them from your own measurements?
The window.
Okay, thank you, Bryce. Very important. Okay, anything else?
We have climate sensors for all our sudden Earth death plots.
Okay, so you have some sensors. All right, what else? Okay, interesting. All right, so as you're likely aware, we had a severe weather episode this morning. In fact, there was actually a tornado watch for our area. It's interesting that nobody said TV. Which is actually a problem for TV. Yeah. So if you're minding your own business this morning, doing your normal morning activities, and you were then interrupted by a tornado watch, you could then go to various TV channels and get further information, or you could go check your phone and look at other information. So, all right. So this is how we get weather data. It sounds like for most of these applications, they're actually very geospatial in that you're wanting to know the weather for a particular location for the time ahead. All right. So this is actually last night's storm, and often weather data sets are some variation of this. This happens to be radar data, which is non-linearly related to rain rate. The data sets are usually presented in a geographic framework. One of the key characteristics of weather information is that it usually moves and changes at the same time. This is true of almost every weather field. We're actually looking at a three-dimensional volume of the atmosphere, but when we present it, because we're usually presenting it in map form, we usually look at maybe one or maybe just two layers at a time. This is just one layer of just the rain. When we present it, we also typically use a color scale that tends to be divided into regions that are associated with different, in this case, intensities of rainfall. Okay, so this is, as I said, a characteristic of many types of weather data. And we're looking at something like this. Maybe we're trying to make a decision about when I need to leave school to make sure I don't get caught in the rain on the way home, or leave home not to get in the rain on the way to school, et cetera. All right, so I've always been very interested in information design. Ever since I was an undergraduate student, and particularly was drawn to these books by Edward Tufte, and they really sort of talk about what is good ways of communicating information using graphs. And so there's, as you can see, there's a number of books. He also gives a workshop that comes around every once in a while. It was here in Raleigh last year. It'll probably come back. I highly recommend it. So he's really sort of focused on not only getting the information right, but how do we communicate it effectively. And effectively, I mean so that people get the appropriate, the intended meaning out of it. So what I want to talk to you a little bit about today are some work from the cognitive sciences related to human perception limitations and how this can interfere with our ability to communicate our science. And in particular, I want to talk about two categories of things. One are color scales, and the other are something called change blindness, where we have a problem seeing a change to the scene. And I'm going to particularly focus on problems when objects move and change at the same time, because this is a particular problem very relevant to meteorology. So color scales, I think a lot of you have sort of been in a situation where you're making a map or a graphic and you're trying to decide what colors to use. Good, useful color scales are one that perform well both in color and in grayscale. The other thing we want to keep in mind is there's actually a fair subset of the population that's got at least partially colorblind. So we want to be able to communicate to everyone and also deal with different kinds of data, linear and nonlinear types of data sets. So this kind of thing, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about these types of things and think about them to some extent. The cartography groups and people who make maps for a living are much more attuned to this than the people who do science visualization. So here's an example from cartography. Just want to kind of maybe just take a look at this. Which do you think is more colorblind friendly? Depiction in A or depiction in B?
B.
Yeah, B, and we'll look at this in a moment, but part of the difference is there's a much bigger difference in contrast between the different colors. So even if we couldn't see the colors clearly, we may be able to see the contrast a little bit better, or the luminance of the image. All right, so it is in fact that it is B. All right, so, but not everyone's gotten this memo. This is the Weather Service. In particular, they seem like they really, like this is a red-green color scale, which is what the most majority of people who are colorblind have, is red-green color blindness. This particular field velocity is what you would look at if you were interested in looking for a tornado. So it's, you know, kind of important. The color scale in the reflectivity, which is what people most often look at, also is not very well suited to someone who is colorblind. All right, so how do we use color scales? One of them is we often use a grayscale. It's hard to remember sometimes, but until recently, color was prohibitively expensive in the journals. And often we had to take our very carefully, well thought out, beautiful color graphic and reduce it to black and white. The problem with black and white, though, is that our ability to discern different shades is actually relatively limited. We can only tell about 10 different shades, even if we're using a continuous scale. So if we want to communicate something quantitatively, it's not the best option, but for a long time, until color became relatively inexpensive, it was the only option we had. All right, and then once people started using color, often the default was this thing called the jet color map, and you see it in a lot of applications, and partly because in some applications like MATLAB, it was the default color map. So there's a couple of problems with this color map in particular. So here's the color map up at the top. And what we've got here is the deltas in perception, how you would see differences as we move through the color map. This is if I just made a black and white version of the color map. So here, notice there's a large area. I'm not seeing little or no differences. And what I've got down here are what you would see if you had moderate to severe color blindness. So one of the problems with these perceptual deltas is when there's a very sharp peak, what we get is essentially an artificial edge. So even though this data is relatively continuous, we get an artificial edge, and that's in some sense overemphasizing a feature that may not be particularly important as an edge of something. And the other problem with this kind of color map is, of course, for those people who have color blindness, they won't be able to distinguish between different ranges. And there's tools online where you can put in your color map and it'll tell you how different types of colorblind people will see it. This is sort of the standard color maps from MATLAB and how they would appear to people who have different kinds of color blindness. All right, so fortunately for color maps, there is a good solution that's been developed, and that is to look what we call a luminance chroma U spiral. So we basically define a spiral in this color space. We use luminance because it's better attuned to the human perception of brightness. Chroma is just saturation, U is just color. And so basically what you do is you define a path along this sphere, and that's how you define a color map. So the one shown at the bottom is one that was developed by Matt Miller. There's also public domain software available at this location to develop other color maps. So when you take this kind of color map, then someone who's colorblind can then look at and understand the details of the data. And also, if you print it in black and white, it also comes out reasonably well. I'm particularly harping on this because you may not realize that some of your colleagues are colorblind, or they may tell you it's not a big deal. I have a little story. I have a friend, Adam, who's in New York, and he and I were working together on a project, and we would have these very weird conversations where he would be like, yeah, I'm looking, we're like Skyping and looking at the same diagrams and stuff like this. He says, I don't see what you're seeing. And this was going on, and he's like, I think, basically he's saying, I think you're crazy. I do whatever, you're not seeing it. And finally, we changed the color scale because he said, well, I'm a little bit colorblind. I said, okay. He says, but I don't really miss anything. But you don't know. So we changed the color scale, and suddenly he's like, oh, yeah, okay. So, all right. So here's an example of use of one of these color maps. This is actually one of our derived products, this drizzle product, which combines data from passive microwave and other sensors to estimate how much drizzle is occurring in different parts of the ocean. So this is the color map up at the top, and then this is actually the MATLAB now is a new default color map, which solves some but not all of the colorblind problems. All right, so what's great about the color map problem is there's a relatively straightforward solution. Just use a different color map, and you can design your own with those online public domain tools. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is something that you may be less familiar with, is this idea of change blindness, where you look at something and you don't even notice, just like my friend Adam, you don't even notice what you're not seeing. All right, so what I want to start with here is start looking at that white dot in the center of the frame and just stare at the white dot. Okay, so what should happen is that your perception is that when you're staring at that white dot, once these things start to move, they stop changing color. But in fact, they are still changing color. So now what I'd like you to do is pick a dot, and when it moves, follow it. And you'll notice that it is indeed changing color. So this is an example of change blindness. Okay, so it happens with color. It happens with size. Yeah, once it starts rotating, it looks like nothing's changed. And it also happens with shape.
It's totally freaky.
Yeah. So this is particularly a problem for meteorologists because, as I said, almost all of our data changes and moves at the same time. So even though we're displaying it on the screen, right, the freaky thing about this is we're displaying it on the screen and the computer's saying, yeah, okay, I gave you the information, but our brains are not getting it because of this change blindness. And this is a fundamental limitation of our visual system. So the people who wrote this paper have an explanation. I'll just let you read it. You can read it faster than I can say it. So just take a moment and read it. So So I think if you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, if you're in the design of the vision system, that it probably does make more sense that if things are changing and moving at the same time, that the brain will prioritize movement. So imagine that you are potentially a prey animal. You're really alert to your surroundings. You're much more attuned to movement. You don't care that the tiger is smiling to frowning as it's approaching you. You're more worried that it's coming at you. But this not only affects meteorology, I think it also has relevance for other applications, some of which I think may be developed here at the center, things like heads-up displays and also virtual reality. So the problem is if the thing is moving too fast, essentially across your retina, that you're going to have a difficulty absorbing all the information. So the question is now, what do we do about this? All right, so I want to talk a little bit about alternate spatial frames, and particularly point to the work of Lagrange, an Italian, and something we call the Lagrangian frame of reference. So the idea here is, instead of having a fixed geographic frame of reference, we're going to move with the object of interest. So just a little animation of that. Here I've got a pendulum swinging in a spatially fixed frame of reference. And then in a Lagrangian frame of reference, it would look like this. So depending on your application, this may be appropriate. And I kind of want to show you some of what we've been doing sort of related to this. So one of the science questions that we're working on is a question related to low marine clouds. So in particular, the difference between the cloud over the ocean, the bright cloud over the ocean, the dark ocean is very different. It's a very different albedo, a very different amount of shortwave that's reflected. So the amount of low clouds over the ocean turns out to be very important for the radiative balance of the Earth. So we're very interested in the physical processes that change the cloudiness. In particular, there's areas of the ocean where we have very persistent areas of large-scale cloudiness. This here is Hurricane Irene, and the kinds of clouds we're looking at are here in the subtropics. So as you can see, it's a very large area. So we're very interested in what causes cloudiness to change. The problem is, back to the standard problem in meteorology, is that things are moving and changing at the same time. In fact, in quite complicated ways, as you can see here. So to try to help myself out, it would be good if we could remove the general flow. One of the things you'll notice is there's an overall flow over here from the southwest to the northeast. So if I could at least get rid of that, that maybe would help me, because then I could focus on the changes in the cloud, because that's really what I'm interested in. I already know about the flow. I'm interested in trying to understand the changes. So what we did is we've essentially removed the prevailing flow of the wind. This green circle is actually a radar data area where we obtain radar data from the ship. So we actually took data from the ship, figured out how the wind was blowing, and then removed that from the field. You can see the latitude, longitudes moving. So we essentially have a frame of reference fixed to the cloud. The clouds are slowly moving to the northwest. And in this way, we get a much better picture about what's happening. So it's visible data, so we're going to go from the sunrise through the day, and then it fades away at the sunset as it loops around. But this gives us a much better picture of what's happening in the clouds. And in this case, what we're seeing is not much is actually happening to the clouds. I haven't perfectly removed all the motion. There's still a little bit of wobble, but you can see that these cloud, little bits of cloud are kind of maybe changing shape a little bit, but they're not changing very much, which is actually an important finding. Another application where we've applied this type of thing is related to snowstorms. So you're probably aware that we're not very good at estimating how much snow is going to fall the day before. This is a particularly spectacular bad forecast from January 2015, where for the New York City area, it was forecast to be 2 to 3 feet of snow, and as a result of this forecast, there was shutdowns of the school system and businesses, et cetera. And then the actual amount of snow was actually considerably less, about 10 inches in the city, a little more out on Long Island, but up in the Westchester County and stuff, only about 2 to 4 inches. So the science question that we're trying to address are, what are the factors governing surface snowfall? So this is actually the snowstorm. And so what I've done here is I've combined radar data from multiple radars in the region. We've scaled it by the snow rate, so the lighter colors are the higher snow rates. And when you see this actual storm develop, what you're going to notice are some areas, kind of linear bands, which we call snow bands. And that's where the snow is locally heavier. And the problem is that it's very difficult to forecast these snow bands and to tell exactly where and when they're going to appear. So as you could imagine, if the snow band passes overhead, you're going to get more snow than if it never comes over you. And you can see sometimes they just kind of move and then stall out and then dissipate. If the snow band sort of sits over you for a while, you're going to get quite a bit of snow. So this is one of the key reasons why we're so bad at estimating snowfall, because we can't really forecast these snow bands. But in order to understand them, I really need to compare them among storms and also to the structure of the storm. And I've got quite a large data set to work with, which also makes things interesting. So again, this is what a winter storm looks like. It's again a problem of things changing and moving. You've probably heard about low pressure centers and fronts. These snowstorms are associated with that kind of storm. So one of the things we can do is, if we know where the low is, we can then sort of look at quadrants around it and say, okay, certain types of structures related to the fronts are associated with different quadrants around the low. So in this kind of storm, the low is a reasonable sort of origin that I can orient the snow information around. So we combined data from 6 radars. We looked at about 108 storms over 20 years. And so it's about 200 days of data and a very large number of radar volumes. There's 30,000 just from one of the radars alone. All right, so what we were able to do is get the information on the low pressure. That information is available every 3 hours. We then sort of linearly interpolate between that, and then we get a coordinate system. You can see that with that cross that's moving along. So that cross is indicating where the low pressure is. And by doing that, I can then put that storm in the context of the low. This helps me understand this storm, and it also helps me, when I look at all 108 storms, how they vary, what's in common and what's different among them. All right, so when we do this, this is what it looks like. And this was actually very revealing, because it really showed us that most of the time these snow bands are occurring in the northwest quadrant, which has particular implications about what forcing is associated with them in the storm. Another thing, and I've got the satellite over there too, is a lot of times we see the bands are actually moving radially away from the low, which would have been hard to see in the geographic framework. So from the point of view of understanding the storm, I'm sort of less interested in what's happening in New York City. I'm more interested in about what are the structures, and that if I orient it around the low, I can get that information. I can always go back to figure out what's happening in New York City. All right, so using this type of information, we actually made some very interesting findings. One was that for some storms, those bands were radiating away from the low toward the northwest quadrant, actually almost fueling bigger bands, making them even more intense and have more snowfall, while other storms actually tended to have snow bands that were relatively stationary relative to the low. And we think these may actually be associated with different kinds of forcings. All right, and then lastly, I just want to mention, among the types of data we're using, we're also looking at non-traditional data sets. One of our projects is looking at rain clouds off the coast of Africa. There's very few operational observations in that area. And one of my students, John Hayter, had an idea about asking the space shuttle astronauts to take pictures out their window. So that's what this is at the bottom there. And so then we have to then orient that relative to the geographic framework so we understand what we're seeing. So just to kind of sum up the types of stuff that my group does, my group is called Environment Analytics. So we use all different kinds of weather and climate data sets. We derive products from raw measurements for specific applications. We always, well, not always, but nearly always end up using big, messy data sets. So we're very used to dealing with it. We spend a lot of time building tools A lot of that is related to quality control. Sometimes that's doing things like removing non-meteorological echo. For the snowstorms, actually one of the projects right now is to remove the parts of the echo that are associated with rain so we can focus on the snow. We also spend an unfortunate amount of time reformatting things for analysis and visualization. And the big picture is that we're usually using multiple sensors to try to synthesize the data together using analytic, visual, and database tools to build a better picture about what's going on in terms of the governing factors of these various types of weather phenomenon. So I just wanted to end with an advertisement for my course next fall. I teach a class in meteorological remote sensing. It's focused particularly on weather radar. As part of the class, we do a project where you design a radar observing system for a particular location and season. That's a team project that goes throughout the semester. There's no prereqs. You basically just need a little bit of algebra. I very routinely have students outside of meteorology take this class. It does count for the MGIST curriculum, so I wanted to encourage the students here to consider taking this class. And lastly, I've got some citations and related work. So thank you very much.
Do you offer a distance ed version of your?
Unfortunately not.
So do we have any questions? Yes? Yes.
Yeah, how does sound play a role in our image perception, and how would that alter how we perceive smoke?
So that's actually something I don't know about. I don't know how sound plays a role. I guess my reading of the cognitive literature has been more focused on the visual system.
How do you get in contact with the astronaut that do
They got a web form, believe it or not.
Oh, cool.
It's been a proposal, but it's like, it took me an hour.
Yeah, I think I get the impression sometimes that the space shuttle astronauts might be a little bored. So no, but I mean, like the types of projects, there's a lot of projects they're doing related to different kinds of landforms and land use, desertification, all sorts of things. So pretty much anything you can take out of the window, they're interested in doing.
Yes,
So how are you geo-rectifying or geo-referencing these astronaut photographs?
Well, we're struggling with that right now because not only, because they just come without any information. There's a time, so you know what time they took the photo, and you can go back and look at the actual orbit and where they were along the orbit. And then usually what we try to do is what I showed, which was we try to pick up a nearby satellite photo and then try to see if we can find common features and then try to figure out exactly what the mapping is.
So it's all manual right now?
Right now it is manual, but I understand many of you have automated tools, and that's one of the reasons why I'm talking to you about this, that you could help us with this.
So here in this, like this feature and this feature would be
Yeah.
here and
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you looking into structure for motion of the clouds with chronological offset?
So we could, I mean, I'm not sure I understand your question completely, but yeah, I mean, one of the things to do by sort of keeping it motionless is we're trying to focus on what happens in time. So by removing the motion, we hope to basically be able to draw our attention, be able to understand what's happening in time better.
What I'm talking about is like a hammerhead cloud.
Mm-hmm.
If you have two photographs that are, say, 30 or 50 miles apart, then it hasn't changed much. But so you could get the 3D structure knowing the positions.
Yeah, that's actually a different area where you take multiple photographs and try to get the 3D. And depending on the application, that can be helpful or not. A lot of times our data sets we don't have the option of having that, unfortunately.
I guess it moves too much, you know.
Well, yeah, you would need multiple observers, basically, is the issue.
Yeah. Yes. Nick, let's see. Okay. You can ask us.
I come from another college My question is that is all the meteorological remote sensing data is available to all the researchers globally, or I mean, is it global meteorological research?
There's a lot of data sets that are publicly available. There's another subset that are publicly available that you have to request, and then there's some data that are behind various paywalls or that you have to wait till they age a certain amount before you access them. So it would really depend on what specifically you were looking at.
For some other regions, not only the North America.
Right. So we've been using a little bit of the Meteosat data so that's centered over the zero meridian. And for that, it is available, but you just have to request it.
It's free.
Yeah, it's free for educational use, yeah.
Thank you. Nick, you have a question?
I think he was up first. Yeah. So
Okay.
is the difficulty when you put in Lagrangian, is that the boundary of the cloud is changing? Is that why?
Well, yeah, but that's part of it, right? So I have to sort of what we did with the data from the Southeast Pacific was we tried to pick a cloud element that was reasonably recognizable through time, and then sort of center on that.
Is there another way to do it if you don't have the ship data that's going through it at the same time?
I think so. The advantage of the ship is we're literally making a direct measurement of the wind. There's a number of methods where you can actually use, where you can actually try to infer the motion from the winds from the clouds, but then it's a little bit less constrained, but you could, to sort of do it more generally, that's what you need to do. But we were fortunate that we had the ship, and then we actually were literally measuring the winds.
So my question related to kind of the cartography and color selection with regards to color blindness. I think, is there a reason why you think that some of the commercial MATLAB, for example, programs have been less than accommodating with these color scales to adjust their default values to?
I'm not really sure. I mean,
from the cartography world, we've had Color Brewer around for a long time.
Right.
And that's always been a good option to choose colors, but I don't know how it would be implemented in.
I think it might also have to almost do with the culture in the sense of that I think cartographers, as a culture, are probably more interdisciplinary. So they're more likely to be aware of these kinds of problems. I think particularly in some of the, and I'll point to meteorology, maybe less interdisciplinary, and so people are they're kind of like, yeah, I know about colorblind people, but it's not something I have to worry about. So I think just the fact that you're more routinely dealing with other disciplines, I think means that cartographers have more exposure, and they're more likely to say, oh yeah, that's important, let's just deal with it, it's not a big deal, let's just deal with it. Yeah.
What about the cultural background when it comes to the color scale? I know it influences elevation because in different countries it has been incorporated with scales, and people have this association.
Right. You bring up a really important point, and that is, from a perception standpoint, if you show things in colors that people are used to seeing, they're more likely to understand it. So, like, even though we know that grayscales aren't great, why do we look at clouds and grayscales? Well, because they are. Right? If we showed clouds in some weird color thing, your brain would be like, well, wait a minute, is it clouds or not? So I think you're absolutely right. In some sense, if you grow up with a particular color scale or use of color scales in particular, particularly like topographic maps, then there's a tendency, right, when we think of that blue is low and yellow and red are high, just because the lower the blue in the oceans and the way the typical mountains are colored in a map.
English maps, the high is white.
Right, the high is white, sometimes the high is white, sometimes the high is red, but I think, yeah, so you can sort of, if you look at a lot of maps, then you're sort of expecting things to look that way, and that is part of a perception as well, because you've sort of trained yourself to interpret things in a particular way.
This is perhaps unrelated, but I was really struck by the exercise where we had to look at the...
Yeah, let's go back and take a look at it again, I think. It's so cool.
Some of your reading, has that been addressed in like criminology? Because obviously police people are actually, they're making decisions in a context where there's like a lot of movement, and movement is the only thing that they see. But but if the shape of a gun or something like that, if you don't see that, is there research done that?
I don't know, but that's actually a really good question. Yeah, I don't know if law enforcement.
Instead of smiling, you just move.
Right. So if you see that they're running, you don't necessarily pick up the details about what they're carrying. So yeah, no, I think this work with these sort of very simple illustrations is actually relatively new. So I'm not sure how far it's permeated.
I wonder if you can get trained to see that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think the problem though is it's fundamentally down to your retina. So if the object is relatively small and moves fast, you're still sort of limited to what your retina can do. So what you could probably do is train yourself to quickly alternate between like staring at the dot and staring at the whole thing. But I think part of the limitation is it's just our, eye-brain vision system. Yeah.
Sandra, thanks. That was really interesting. You mentioned hoping to learn a lot about what people are doing in geospatial analytics. I think it's also important for everybody to think about what's going on in atmospheric modeling. I've long admired all the things you all do, but there has been this disconnect that's unfortunate. I think there is an opportunity for a lot of synergies. I guess that's because people in geospatial science tend to focus on terrestrial problems. We're down here.
Right, but I think,
But many of the approaches are similar.
Right,
and
right, exactly.
I'm excited about the cross-community.
Yeah, so I mean, that gets back to the sort of commonalities in practice. We have many similar problems. Our applications are slightly different, but our underlying issues are actually quite similar. And there is an interface, and one of the most obvious one, I was talking to Paul about this a little before, is the precipitation, where what's coming out of the atmosphere then impacts the surface.
So how much of your work has focused on couplings between terrestrial and atmospheric problems?
Some. I mean, I've done a fair amount of work with looking at rain in different kinds of ways in terms of the frequency of rain and the amounts of rain and where it falls relative to topography and different wind directions and things like that. So I have done a fair amount of work with that using both radar and satellite and surface data sets.
And I learn about it from the students that Sandra sends to my class. So
we send a lot of students.
They try to put together the terrestrial data that are in GIS with the data that they are measuring and they are working with. Yeah. So there are first steps in getting there. Yeah, Irene.
So one of the things that the Center for Geospatial Analytics does very well is kind of marrying modeling and observations in a geospatial framework. How does meteorology do this? And
so
could we kind of think
I think there might, okay, so one of the problems, and this actually just came up in my intro class, when we're trying to describe a complicated three-dimensional structure in the atmosphere, we tend to do it, as I said, one layer at a time. And this just came up in class. It's quite confusing for students, because I've got different things going on at different layers. So this is a problem when we try to compare output from models to observations, because we tend to compare like what's going on at the surface or what's going on halfway up in the atmosphere, but we often don't look at the three-dimensional airflows or the sloping frontal surfaces. So I think that's something that atmospheric science struggles with. There's other issues with comparing observations to model output, but I think just that sort of spatial issue, the fact that we're looking at three-dimensional structures, is something that we just really haven't gotten around. And watching these intro students really struggle, because they're just learning, how do I take these maps at different altitudes and put them together in my head? Just watching them struggle with this really reminded me how difficult the problem actually is.
More questions?
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
So I think, the most typical thing people do with output from some models, WRF is popular, is to use that synthetic radar.
Yeah, I didn't mention that for a reason, yes. Yeah. Okay.
And so and they're doing comparisons. But they're doing the comparisons, and of course, now people animate those things, right? So they're doing comparisons then that have, to try to get salience out of that between the observations and a model. But it has all the percent problems that people have here. So it's very easy for people to fool themselves. They've got a great model.
Yeah, I would.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when I sit in conferences and watch people say, okay, here's my model output, and I'm going to show that it's reasonable, a lot of times it passes what I call the fuzzy eye test, which is if I take off my glasses and look at it, it looks reasonable. But if I put my glasses on, it's like, well, wait a minute. So, I mean, that's the thing. The other problem is the atmosphere is chaotic. We're never going to get the supercell in the exact right place at the exact right time. So we don't have an expectation of perfect fidelity either.
Okay. More questions?
So I guess just one more, since you mentioned that kind of visualizing and understanding three-dimensional structures is a real educational challenge for meteorology. Are there new kind of visualization technologies or some analog of like our tangible landscapes that might be useful in atmospheric context?
I don't know. I mean, and that's part of why I'm here, is to, because I know you guys are doing a lot of work with, you know, virtual reality, and you've got the tangible landscapes, and that's kind of one of my questions is how can you help us better communicate to our students and to weather users what is going on, because ultimately what happens at the surface is dictated by that complicated structure aloft. So to really understand it, you do need to communicate some information about that 3D structure.
So can we make a tangible atmosphere?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe we should talk about it.
Aaron's the first one to say that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I think we have exhausted our time.
Okay.